So once you have your portrait sized and printed, the next thing you're going to do is prep it for cutting. When you look at the photo, you might be confused at first of, what lines do I cut? Where do I go? There are various software programs that you can use to create your cut lines. But for me, I'm not super tech savvy and it's not something that I've invested my time in learning. So I do it the old fashioned way. You'll see here on this version of the portrait, I have drawn my cut lines by hand with a red pen. The reason why I chose a red pen is because it's a bit easier visually to see it when you're cutting. And if you look at it, I simply look for the big sections and cut them out. I'm not going to cut all the individual lines on the tie. I'll cut out the tie on its own and then add those as painted details later. The same with the florals. You can see I've just done the exterior line of the florals and I'll be adding in some carved and painted details after the fact. In order to get to this point where you're prepped and ready to cut, there are a few things that you are going to need. So you will need your material that you're planning to cut. I've chosen to use 1/2 inch MDF because it's a really easy material to cut as well as an easy material to sand and shape. The entire thing is going to be painted, so MDF is a really great option. You could use something like a wood, however, because a lot of the elements in that pattern are white, using wood is a little bit difficult because wood can release tannins, which will yellow your white paint over time. So that's a few of the reasons why I chose to use MDF. When you're prepping your material, it's important to protect it with either painter's tape or contact paper. Contact paper is basically just like shelf liner. It's a sticky sheet. I use it often. You can get it at the dollar store. You can get it at Amazon. But if I'm prepping something and I'm not going to cut it for a few days, I typically will use the tape because the contact paper can start to lift if you're not cutting right away. But it is a really great option if you're going to be cutting within 24 hours of applying it to your material. The other thing that you'll need is spray glue. Spray glue is how you are going to attach your paper printout to your material. The painter's tape and the contact paper protect your material from the glue so you can easily stick your paper design on top. A lot of people ask, why do you do that protective layer before you attach the paper? Why not just put the paper directly onto the material? You absolutely can do that. When I first started, I would just glue my paper template directly to the material, but I learned a few things really fast. If you're using spray adhesive, which is a very strong glue, and you put it directly on the wood, it is very hard to get this paper off once you've glued it on. You're going to spend a lot of time sanding and pulling it off. The other thing is if you're using MDF, MDF is a very porous material. So if you're spraying glue on top of it, some of that glue is going to seep into the material. Yes, you can sand off the top layer, but when you go to paint it, especially if you're using spray paint, the chemical reaction between the glue that remains and the paint that you're using can react, which can cause issues with your finish in the long run. That's why I always recommend protecting your material with either the tape or the contact paper. So once you've got your design printed, you've drawn on the lines that you want to cut out, you've glued it to your material, it's time to plan your pilot holes. Pilot holes are really important because that is where you are going to start your cutting. I'll give you an example of where I put mine. You can see both of these people wear glasses. For those pilot holes, I put them right in the middle. You might think, why would you do that? You're wrecking that piece. For me, putting that right in the middle makes it easy to use wood filler to fill that in and then paint it. If I put it too close to the edge of the glasses, it's gonna make the glasses portion really fragile, especially because I'm limited with the size of drill bit that I can use. The other thing to look at is the lettering. So you can see the interior cuts of these letters are also part of the picture. So I need to keep those pieces. For those, I'm going to put the pilot hole as close to the edge as possible so that I can fill that in or even sand it so that it slots in like a puzzle piece and you won't notice that little hole. The other pilot holes that you'll need will simply be on the exterior edges because there aren't going to be a lot of interior cuts. You can basically start cutting at any point, cutting out piece by piece in order to cut out the entire puzzle. So what I'm going to do now is show you how I'm going to cut each of the various elements. First thing that I'm going to do is cut this to manageable size. This was just a scrap piece of MDF I had from another project. This fit perfectly, so I'm going to cut off the excess, and then you can see the name Diaz at the top doesn't actually puzzle in with any of the picture. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that name out itself so that I can cut the name separately and then the main portrait portion on its own. Because I have a 20-inch scroll saw, it's easier to manage when I have smaller sections. So if you can, it's really awesome to be able to divide it into manageable sections when you're cutting. So that's the first step, making sure that it's in a format that you can easily cut. One last note before I start getting cutting, wearing a dust mask is super important, especially if you're working with MDF. MDF is a compressed paper material that has a lot of different chemicals and glue within it. So when that dust releases, it's super important to protect your lungs. I wear this Trend Technology dust mask. It's been a lifesaver. I also have a dust extractor attached to my saw and an air scrubber in my shop. Always safety first. So now that I have my portrait cut to a manageable size, I'm going to start cutting it out. I'm going to be using two different types of blades to cut out this portrait. As you can see, there are some really detailed portions, like the inner portion of the eye section, the glasses. For those sections, I'll be using a number 3 modified geometry blade. The reason why I'm choosing a number 3 blade is because it is smaller than the widely used number 5 blade. It's thinner, so the kerf or the trace of the blade, which is basically just the amount of material that is going to be taken away when you're cutting, is smaller. So when you're cutting out something super thin like eyeglasses, using a lower number blade is going to give you a lot more accuracy and it's going to take away less material, so it's less likely to break. A note though, the lower the number of the blade, the higher the TPI or teeth per inch, which means that's a faster cutting blade. So I will typically take my speed down to a 3 or a 4, which is less than half of the speed of my saw, in order to keep those cuts really accurate. For the rest of the portrait and as well as the lettering portions, I'm going to be using a number 5 modified geometry blade. The reason why I'm switching to a 5 is for the reasons I just mentioned. A number 5 blade isn't going to cut quite as aggressively or as fast as a number 3. So when I'm doing the larger sections, I don't have to worry about keeping my speed low. I can crank my speed up and I'm able to cut it accurately. The kerf isn't a huge issue because I'm going to be puzzling the pieces back together after I paint. So the millimeter or so excess material taken away, probably half a millimeter between a 3 and a 5, isn't really going to matter. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the interior cuts first with the number 3 blade. The reason why you start with the interior cuts is because if you try to do the exterior cuts first and then go to do the inside cuts, you're going to be dealing with some really fragile pieces, and it's much easier to cut the fragile pieces before. So I'm going to start with the eyes, as well as the interior sections of the letters. And again, cutting the interior first is going to keep the piece much more stable when you're cutting it out. Another thing to note when you're cutting is you need a place to put the pieces as you're cutting. So I actually have our unfinished backer for this project where I'm going to put the pieces in a puzzle as I cut them onto this backer. It helps me keep track of them, and then when I'm sanding and shaping them later on, they're all together in one place. All right, so let's get cutting.
To begin your cuts, you'll want to feed your blade through your pilot hole and then attach it at both the top and the bottom of your saw. Once it is securely in place, you'll want to adjust your tension so that the blade is tight enough, but not too tight that it will snap. Next, you're going to set your speed, and as I said, for inside cuts, I typically go mid-speed, which is around a 3 or a 4 on my DeWALT saw. Don't forget, always make sure you have your dust mask on and start cutting. As you cut, you'll want to make sure that you're staying as close to the line as possible, as these pieces are going to puzzle back in once you are done cutting. You want to make sure that it has a really snug fit. Since these pieces are puzzling back together, you'll have to do your sharp turns rather than doing out and back cuts for your corners. That means you'll have to make sure that you slow down your blade to stop it from cutting and make your really smooth turns in order to get a sharp and accurate corner. Once you have your piece cut out, you can see the pilot hole is very small, which can easily be filled with wood filler and then painted, and you won't even be able to tell. As I mentioned, for the smaller detailed sections, I'm using a number 3 modified geometry blade in order to ensure that I get the most accurate cut. With the glasses being so thin, I want to make sure that I have enough material and enough space to make a really clean cut, which is why I want to use a very accurate cutting blade.
All right, this looks kind of freaky now, but you can see I've done all of the interior cuts for the portrait, and it's not very many. So what I'm going to do now is drill a pilot hole of where I want to start. So I mentioned that I'm going to be using a number 3 blade for the smaller details and a number 5 for the bigger. So here you can see the glasses are going to be really thin. That's where I'm going to start. I'm going to drill a pilot hole right here and right here so that I can go ahead in and cut out the glasses portion. Then I'm going to switch my blade to number 5 so I can cut out the larger sections. Basically, when I'm doing puzzle cuts like this, I just start at one point and I work my way through the image, cutting it out piece by piece. It's fairly simple once you get started, even though it might look complex when it looks like this.
Drilling pilot holes for the exterior cuts is really important. You might be tempted to cut from the outside edge. However, drilling pilot holes allows you to keep the material stable. When you're doing a puzzle cut, you want to make sure you have as much control as possible. When cutting detailed interior portions, you want to make sure that you always have control. Because these pieces are going to be puzzled back together, there is very little room for error. For this, as I said, I'm using a number 3 blade, which is a very accurate cutting blade. Because number 3 blades have a higher TPI or teeth per inch, they are a very fast cutting blade. That is why I have my speed set lower so that I am always staying in control while I make these accurate smaller cuts. So you can see here, with a little bit of patience and a really good blade, you can cut out some really cool details. When cutting out the larger portions, I use a number 5 modified geometry blade. This part is much faster. I'm able to increase my speed and cut it out section by section. You can see as I cut out the pieces, I'm placing them on the board beside me so that I'm keeping track of each of them and not losing any of those small detailed portions. It's very important to always remain in control when you're cutting these, again, because there's very little room for error when the pieces are going to be puzzled back together.
As you can see, I've cut out the vast majority of the portrait. I started at the top of each person and worked my way down, cutting it section by section. Now that I'm into the puzzled letter portion, it's a little bit trickier. So you can see there's some really small details that need to be kept, especially in the corners. So it's really important when you're cutting to keep in mind the best way to cut quarters when you need it to be a sharp corner is take your blade down into the corner. Stop your blade from cutting by removing the pressure with your hands. Do a quick turn and then cut up the other side because I actually want to keep the detail that's in this corner. I can't go down, out, and then back the other side because I need it to stay all together. So some of these sharp corners won't be quite as sharp as if you were cutting it out just a name on its own, but that's okay because it'll puzzle back together and look really good. So now that I'm at the part with the word, what I'm going to do is focus on cutting out these top sections that have sort of smaller details here. And then I'll go through and cut out the bottom so that I keep the larger sections intact.
I've zoomed in here to try to give you a very good view of how I'm cutting. This is in real time using a number 5 modified geometry blade, and my speed is around a 6 or 7 on my DeWALT saw. You can see my focus is making sure that my project is stable and steady. I'm going very slow, ensuring that I'm getting an accurate cut. As I come up into the corners, what I'm going to be focusing on is removing the pressure with my hands to ensure that that blade stops moving. You should be able to take your hands off with the blade going and it won't move. Once you get into that corner, you are going to want to turn your piece as quickly as possible while remaining in control of the piece to get that really sharp corner. So you can see I'm stopping the blade here, removing my hands, doing the turn, and coming up around the other side. This is how you'll get a very sharp corner without having to do the out and back cuts. Here you can see the end result of that corner.
This is a super quick refresher on how to cut out scrolled lettering on your scroll saw. So the first thing you're going to do is drill your pilot holes for your interior cuts, and you're going to do the inside cuts first. The reason why we do the inside cuts first is because if you cut the entire outside and then came back to try and cut those inside portions, you're going to have a very fragile piece, and it's likely that you are going to break it. By cutting the insides first, we are going to keep the project stable for when we go to cut the outsides. Now that I'm done my inside cuts, I'm going to go ahead and start cutting the outside. Another tip that I have for you is don't cut from the outside edge in, even when you're going to do the outside cuts, because that will cause instability in your piece. Once you start working, it'll start to separate where you cut from the outside edge, which will cause you to be holding it so you're pushing it together, which can cause your blade to flex and you're gonna get some wonky cuts. Always drill a pilot hole, both for your interior cuts and to start your outside cuts.
Another tip for when you are cutting your pieces is to always start on an edge. When you cut into your piece, you're going to leave a little lip where you begin and end your cuts. So if that is on a corner, it's much easier to sand and remove when you're done. It's really important to focus on keeping your piece stable as you're cutting. You can see I have one hand bracing my work, making sure there's little vibration, and the other hand is guiding the material through the blade, not pushing, but guiding, allowing the blade to do the work. If you find yourself pushing or forcing the material through the blade, in all likelihood, what is happening is your speed is going too slow or you aren't using the proper blade. You want to make sure that you very gently are applying pressure to the wood and not forcing it, because if you force it, what ends up happening is your blade will flex, causing uneven cuts or possibly even breaking your blade or breaking the piece that you're working on. You can see in the finished piece here, I began and ended my cut in the corner of that eye, so there isn't that awkward lip in the middle of my piece. It's right on a corner, which is easily sandable, which takes us to the next portion, sanding and shaping your piece.
So now that we have the entire portrait cut out, what I'm going to do now is peel off the pattern and the tape, and then I'm going to get started on sanding. So this is what the portrait looks like once you have the tape and pattern removed. You can see that there are several areas where I've drilled pilot holes that will need to be filled in slightly with some basic wood filler. So what I'm going to do is just fill those little holes, let them dry, and then I will get to sanding. So now that we've cut out our entire portrait, it's time to move on to sanding and shaping. When I'm working on a portrait, I typically only use one sanding tool, and that's this. This is a micro zip. You can get it from Gator Finishing, and in Canada, it's sold under the Benchmark brand at home hardware stores. But basically, it's just a foam pad with sanding strips that you can put on the bottom, which makes it really easy to sand the edges off. Another really cool tool though that I recently purchased because my friend Bob White, you can find him on Instagram at High Flyer Canada. He recommended these really cool sanding sticks off of Amazon. They come in a low grit pack and a high grit pack. I got the high grit, which I think is 220, 300, 400, and 500 grit. So it's very similar to the micro zip. It's got a thin piece of sandpaper that you can, as it wear out, roll it around, which is really neat. So I'm going to use those as well when I'm trying to get into the really tiny thin areas that this sander can't. So that's basically all you need, a micro zip or one of these, or if you don't have either of those, you can just grab something like, a piece of normal sandpaper, fold it up and use that along the edges too. Whatever you have on hand will likely work.
When sanding each section of the portrait, I focus on removing the sharp edge, creating a slight rounded over effect. This will really distinguish between each of the sections, and it also ensures that you have a good surface for the paint to adhere to. I also focus on the edges, removing all of the fuzzy imperfections that are brought up during cutting, and I also smooth the top of the surface, and then I'll flip it over and remove the back portion as well, and you can see it slots back in perfectly. As I sand through the sections, I make sure that any of the really super detailed portions are sanded very lightly. You want to make sure that you're not breaking them after you've spent so much time cutting them. So this is why sanding by hand, especially for the portraits, is important, because a lot of the pieces are very delicate. Again, I'm focusing on the edges, making sure that it has a nice little rounded over effect, making sure that the surface is prepared for the paint finishing. So you can see the difference here. This side is sanded and shaped, so you can see the distinct lines between the pieces. On this side, if you push the pieces together, it's really hard to see that line. So you can see the difference, shaping off that sharp edge, sanding it over so that you make it smooth, really gives the distinct line and shape to your piece versus the not sanded portion. So I'm gonna go ahead and get the next side sanded before I move on to priming and painting.